Hey guys, tonight we are diving deep, and I mean literally, deep underground into one of the most staggering archaeological discoveries of all time. Imagine you're an emperor, the most powerful person in your known world. What do you want to take with you to the afterlife? Your favorite snacks? A solid gold PlayStation? Well, the guy we're talking about tonight, he thought bigger. He decided to take his entire army. And not just a symbolic one. We're talking thousands and thousands of life-sized, fully equipped soldiers ready for battle. It's the kind of flex that makes you realize just how small our modern ambitions can be. It also makes you realize that if you lived back then, a casual sneeze during a royal procession could have permanently ended your career and possibly your entire bloodline. You probably wouldn't have made it to Tuesday. Speaking of where you are right now, I'd love to know. Drop your city and the time in the comments below, so I can get a picture of our little community scattered across the globe, all listening in together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story doesn't begin with a grand archaeologist or a dusty ancient text. It starts with the sun. A relentless, unforgiving sun beating down on the yellow, cracked earth of China's Shaanxi province. The year was 1974, and the season was a spring that felt more like a cruel midsummer. For the farmers of Xiang Village, a small, dusty hamlet in Lintong County, this was a time of deep anxiety. The rain, which should have been nourishing the winter wheat, had simply forgotten to arrive. The air was thick, not with moisture, but with fine, golden dust that coated everything. The sparse leaves on the persimmon trees, the tiled roofs of the simple houses, and the back of your throat with every breath. The village's main well, a lifeline that had served generations, was becoming stingy. Each bucket hauled up from its depths seemed to contain more mud and less water than the last. The water that did come up was murky, carrying the taste of earth and desperation. In this part of China, the land is a capricious character in everyone's life story. It gives, but it also takes away. It holds millennia of history just beneath its surface, a fact the villagers knew mostly through folklore and the occasional shard of old pottery turned up by a plow. They lived on the doorstep of history, with the tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, just a short distance away. But ancient emperors don't fill empty water buckets. The mound of the emperor's tomb was just another feature of the landscape, a silent, grassy hill that offered no relief from the punishing drought. The days bled into one another in a haze of heat and worry. The men of the village would gather in the slivers of shade cast by their low-slung homes, their faces etched with the same concern. They'd smoke their long-stemmed pipes, the smoke mingling with the dust, and speak in low tones about the wilting crops. The wheat stalks, which should have been green and plump, were turning a sickly yellow-brown, drooping as if in surrender. This wasn't just about thirst, it was about survival. A failed harvest meant a hungry winter. It meant the difference between making it through the year and facing genuine hardship. They talked about the old stories, the legends of dragons who controlled the rains. Had they offended some celestial being? Was this a punishment? Or was it just the cyclical cruelty of nature? Whatever the cause, the effect was brutally clear. The land was dying of thirst, and they were tied to it. The usual sounds of a bustling village were muted. There was less laughter, fewer children chasing chickens through the alleyways. Instead, there was the rhythmic, weary creak of the shoulder poles carrying near-empty buckets, and the soft, collective sigh of a community holding its breath, waiting for a miracle. They had tried the usual things. They dug channels to divert what little moisture remained. They rationed their water with painful care. But it was like trying to fill a vast cavern with a teaspoon. The scale of the problem dwarfed their efforts. The old well was failing them. It was a deep, stone-lined pit of history and community, but its generosity had run dry. Every morning, the villagers would peer down into its dark throat, and every morning, the glint of water seemed a little farther away, a little more mocking. This persistent, grinding reality forced a slow, creeping thought into the minds of the village leaders. The old ways weren't working. The old well was giving up. If they wanted water, truly life-saving water, they would have to find it themselves. They would have to go deeper. The idea was daunting. Digging a new well was backbreaking work, a gamble with no guarantee of success. They could spend weeks digging only to hit solid rock or, worse, nothing at all. But as the sun continued its relentless assault and the cracks in the earth grew wider, looking like a map of their despair, the gamble started to seem less like a choice and more like a necessity. The soil beneath their feet, the very ground they cursed for its dryness, held the key. They just didn't know that it held far more than water. It held an army, frozen in time, waiting patiently in the dark, silent earth for the scrape of a shovel that would break a 2,000-year-old silence. Among the men gathered in the slivers of shade, there was one named Yang Jifa. He was in his late 30s, a man shaped by the land he worked. He wasn't particularly tall or short, strong but not brawny, with a face that was a testament to a life lived under the sun. His skin was the color of toasted wheat, and the lines around his eyes were etched not just by age, but by years of squinting at the horizon, searching for rain clouds that rarely came. He was a man of few words, a practical farmer who trusted the strength in his back and the knowledge in his hands more than any lofty promises or ancient superstitions. He sat with his younger brothers and a few other members of their production team under the village's largest persimmon tree. This tree was an institution. It was old, gnarled, its bark thick and deeply grooved like an old man's face. In a good year, its branches would be heavy with sweet, flame-colored fruit. This year, its leaves were curled and dusty, offering a brittle, inadequate shade. This was the village square, the community hall, and the newsroom all rolled into one. Here, under its tired branches, decisions were made. The air was still, heavy with the scent of hot dust and dry smoked tobacco. The conversation, which had been a low, circular murmur of complaints about the drought, began to change. The shared misery was solidifying into a shared purpose. It was no longer enough to talk about the problem. Someone had to propose a solution. And the only solution left on the table was digging a new well. It was a daunting prospect. This wasn't just digging a hole for a fence post. This was a major engineering project, undertaken with the most basic of tools, shovels, picks, and wicker baskets to haul out the earth. It was a gamble. You could dig for days, weeks even, enduring back-breaking labor, only to hit a solid slab of rock just out of reach of the water table. Or you could dig and find nothing but more dry, unforgiving earth. It was a huge investment of time and precious calories, all based on a guess.
"The old well is finished,"
one of the older men said, knocking the ash from his pipe against the heel of his cloth shoe.
"It's giving us more mud than drink."
"My wheat looks like dried grass,"
another added, his voice flat with resignation. Yang Jifa listened, his gaze fixed on the cracked ground at his feet. He was a man of action, and all this talk was starting to feel as useless as the dried-up well. He drew a slow breath, the dusty air scratching his lungs. He had a family to feed. His brothers had families to feed. Their survival depended on this land, and the land was failing them. Inaction was a slow, guaranteed failure. The gamble of digging, as risky as it was, felt like the only path that held any sliver of hope. He looked over at his brothers, Yang Peiyang and Yang Chueni. They were younger, but they shared his quiet, determined nature. He caught their eye, and a silent understanding passed between them. They were all thinking the same thing. Finally, Yang Jifa spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tired murmur.
"We can't wait for the sky,"
he said simply.
"We have to dig."
The statement hung in the hot, still air. It was what everyone was thinking, but saying it out loud made it real. It transformed a desperate idea into a concrete plan. The others looked at him. There were nods of agreement. The quiet farmer had just become the leader of their last-ditch effort. Now came the second, equally important question: where? You couldn't just start digging anywhere. It had to be a calculated guess. This wasn't a job for geological surveys or fancy equipment. This was a decision based on folk wisdom, a feel for the land, and a healthy dose of hope. They talked about a spot to the west, but someone remembered a failed attempt there years ago. They talked about a place closer to the village, but the ground was too hard, littered with stones. Then, someone pointed to a small grove of persimmon trees a little way south of the village, on a patch of wasteland that wasn't good for much else. The thinking was simple, almost primal. Where trees grew, there must be water deep below. The ground there also seemed a little softer, a little more forgiving. It was as good a spot as any. A decision, born of desperation and homespun logic, was made. They would dig there. The spot was about 100 yards south of the village, in a place where the earth was a reddish, sandy loam. Yang Jifa and his brothers, along with a few others from their team, would start the next morning. They would take their shovels, their picks, and their shoulder poles with the 2 large baskets. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the fields, the meeting under the persimmon tree broke up. The men walked back to their homes, their steps heavy with the thought of the labor to come, but also lit by a tiny spark of purpose. That evening, Yang Jifa checked his tools. He ran his hand over the worn, smooth wood of his shovel handle. It was a familiar weight, an extension of his own arms. Tomorrow, he would plunge it into the earth, hoping to find the clear, life-giving water their village so desperately needed. He had no idea he was about to strike something else entirely. He was about to knock on the door of an ancient kingdom. The next morning, the sun rose with the same unforgiving intensity. There was no dew on the ground, no hint of moisture in the air. The sky was a vast, pale, cloudless expanse. Yang Jifa and his small team, his brothers and a couple of other villagers, met at the chosen spot as the first light painted the eastern horizon. The air was cool for now, but they knew it wouldn't last. They had to make the most of the morning before the heat became unbearable. The site was a patch of unremarkable land. A few scraggly persimmon trees, their leaves already wilting, dotted the area. The ground was dry, reddish-brown earth, cracked on the surface. They marked out a circle, roughly 6 feet in diameter, the intended mouth of their well. Without much ceremony, they began to dig. The work was brutal and monotonous. 1 or 2 men would be in the hole, loosening the earth with heavy picks, their muscles straining with each swing. The rhythmic thud of the pick striking the ground was the only sound, punctuated by grunts of effort. Others would then shovel the loosened soil into large wicker baskets. When a basket was full, the men at the top would lower a rope, hook it onto the basket's handle, and haul it up, hand over hand. They'd dump the earth a short distance away, creating a growing mound of reddish soil, then lower the empty basket back into the deepening pit. The first few feet were relatively easy. The topsoil was loose. But as they dug deeper, the earth became harder, more compacted. It was a dense, stubborn clay that clung to their shovels and resisted the bite of the pick. The sun climbed higher, and sweat began to pour down their faces, stinging their eyes and soaking their simple cotton shirts. They worked in shifts, rotating between digging, shoveling, and hauling, taking short breaks to sip precious water from a shared flask. One day bled into the next. The hole grew steadily deeper. 5 feet, 10 feet, 15. They were now well below the surface, working in a cylindrical world of packed earth. The light at the bottom of the pit grew dimmer, and the air became cooler, thick with the smell of damp clay. They had dug past the root systems of the persimmon trees, and their hope began to rise. This deep, they should be getting close to the water table. It was on the third day, March 23, 1974, a date that would mean nothing to them at the time, that things changed. Yang Zhifa was the one in the pit. He was now about 16 feet down. The space was cramped, the walls of the well pressing in on him. He swung his pick, the heavy tool arcing through the dim light. He was aiming for a chunk of particularly hard-packed earth. Instead of the familiar, dull thud of metal hitting clay, the pick met something with a sharp, resonant clank. It wasn't the dead, grating sound of hitting rock. This was different. It sounded hollow, brittle. The force of the blow vibrated up the wooden handle and into his arms. He paused, curiosity piqued. He assumed it was just a piece of an old jar or a large stone. This area, so close to the ancient capital, was littered with the debris of past dynasties. Turning up old roof tiles or pottery shards was common. He grunted, annoyed at the obstacle, and swung again, trying to break it apart or work his way around it. Clank again. This time, a piece of the object broke free. He bent down in the gloom, his eyes struggling to adjust. He picked up the fragment. It was curved and felt strangely dense in his hand. It wasn't stone. It was some kind of fired clay, a type of pottery. But it was unusually thick, much thicker than any pot or jug he'd ever seen. He tossed the piece into the basket to be hauled up and went back to digging. He carefully worked the pick around the edges of the object. It was large. As he cleared more earth away, a shape began to emerge. It was rounded, like a large bowl or a vat. He kept digging. More of it became visible. Then he saw it. A shape that was undeniably a shoulder. And then, a neck. He froze, his pick held in midair. His heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't a pot. This wasn't a jar. He scraped away more dirt with his hands, his fingers digging into the cool, damp earth. A human form was emerging from the ground. It was a life-size torso, made of terracotta. He could see the faint outline of armor plates sculpted onto its chest. He called up to his brothers at the surface.
Hey, come look at this.
His voice, muffled by the depth of the well, sounded strange. They peered down, their faces silhouetted against the bright circle of the sky.
What is it?
One of them shouted back.
I don't know.
Yang Zhifa replied, his voice a mixture of confusion and excitement.
It looks like a tile god. A Wagwanyi.
Wagwanyu was the local slang for a temple statue or a kill-fired deity. They'd seen them in local temples, but never one like this, buried so deep in the earth. He continued to clear away the soil, and the form became clearer. It was the upper body of a man, sculpted with incredible detail. It had no head and no legs, just a powerful-looking torso, seemingly standing guard in the silent darkness. The men at the top hauled up the basket filled with the dirt and the initial fragments. They looked at the strange, thick pottery. This was no ordinary find. The air, which moments before had been filled with the grunts of labor, was now charged with a nervous energy. They had been searching for water, the source of life. Instead, they had struck something old, something unknown, something that felt both wondrous and deeply unsettling, as if they had accidentally woken something that had been sleeping for a very, very long time. Word of the strange discovery spread through the small team of well diggers like a spark in dry grass. The work stopped. The rhythmic thud of the pick was replaced by a low murmur of excited, nervous chatter. The men who had been at the surface scrambled to get a better look, peering down into the dark hole where Yang Zhifa stood beside his bizarre discovery. The object was undeniably the shape of a man, or at least, the torso of one. But who would bury a statue in the middle of a field, so deep underground? The initial excitement quickly began to curdle into something else: suspicion and fear. In rural China, especially in the 1970s, the world was still thick with folklore, superstition, and a deep-seated respect for the unseen. The earth wasn't just soil and rock, it was a place of ancestors, spirits, and dragons. The nearby tomb of the first emperor was a place of immense power, and it was said to be protected by curses and traps. They had, after all, disturbed a place that had lain untouched for centuries, maybe millennia. One of the older villagers, a man named Yang Wenyu, squinted down into the pit, his face a mask of concern.
This is not a good sign.
He muttered, shaking his head slowly.
To find a stone man while digging for water, it could mean bad luck.
The term they used, Wagwanyi or tile god, was a catch-all for any human-like figure made of pottery. But these were usually found in temples, places of worship. Finding one here, in the dark earth, felt fundamentally wrong. It felt like a desecration, an intrusion.
It could be a guardian from a tomb.
Another man whispered, the words hanging heavy in the air.
Maybe we've disturbed an ancestor's rest.
This idea was particularly chilling. The concept of disturbing the dead was a profound taboo. It was believed to bring misfortune not just upon the individuals responsible, but upon the entire village. Illness, crop failure, drought, all could be retribution from angered spirits. And here they were, in the midst of a terrible drought, having just unearthed a silent, earthen man who looked suspiciously like a guard. The connection was immediate and terrifying. Yang Jifa, still in the hole, was more practical, but even he couldn't shake a feeling of unease. He ran his hand over the statue's smooth, hard surface. The craftsmanship was incredible. He could feel the individual plates of the armor under his fingertips. This was no crude village idol. This was the work of a master. But what was it doing here? As they continued to dig cautiously around the figure, they found more. Fragments of legs. A disembodied arm. And then another one. And another. The bottom of their well was becoming a chaotic jumble of terracotta body parts. It wasn't just one statue, it was many, all broken and scattered. They also found strange, long, bronze objects. They were sharp and triangular at the tip. To the farmers, they looked like some kind of strange metal tool, but their shape was undeniably menacing. They were arrowheads, hundreds of them, lying in bundles. The initial discovery of a single tile god was strange. Finding a whole group of them, shattered and buried with weapons, was deeply unnerving. The well project was now completely forgotten. The new priority was figuring out what to do with these things. Back on the surface, the debate raged. Fear was a powerful motivator.
We should put it all back.
One man argued, his voice tight with anxiety.
Cover it up. Pretend we never saw it. We were digging a well, we hit rock, we stopped. That's the story.
Many nodded in agreement. It was the safest option, a way to appease whatever spirits they might have angered. Others, driven by a flicker of curiosity and a dose of pragmatism, were not so sure. These pottery fragments were old. Old things sometimes had value. Maybe not much, but perhaps they could be sold for a few yuan. In a time of such hardship, every little bit counted.
Maybe the cultural station in the county town would want them.
Someone suggested.
They collect old things.
The village was split. The older generation, steeped in tradition and superstition, saw only a bad omen. They began to give Yang Jifa and his brothers a wide berth, whispering behind their hands. Children were told to stay away from the haunted well. The find was becoming a source of social friction, a strange, earthen wedge driving a line between fear and curiosity. Yang Jifa himself was caught in the middle. His practical farmer's mind told him this was just old pottery. Incredibly well-made old pottery, but pottery nonetheless. Yet, he couldn't entirely dismiss the whispers of his elders, the ingrained folklore of his childhood. Had he cursed his village? He looked at the cracked, dry fields around him. The drought was already a curse. Could things get worse? That evening, the fragments lay near the side of the pit, a macabre collection of terracotta limbs and torsos gleaming faintly in the moonlight. They looked like casualties of a forgotten, silent battle. The villagers avoided the site, the usual evening foot traffic taking a wide detour. The place felt different now. The air itself seemed to buzz with a strange, ancient energy. The farmers had wanted to pull life-giving water from the earth. Instead, the earth had given them its dead, its silent, watchful guardians. And no one, not the superstitious elders nor the pragmatic diggers, had any idea what to do with them. They were just farmers. They knew how to read the sky and the soil, but they had no idea how to read the secrets of an emperor's tomb. The days that followed were filled with a tense and uncertain atmosphere. The half-dug well sat abandoned, a gaping wound in the earth, with its strange terracotta secret piled beside it. The initial flurry of fear began to subside, replaced by a more practical, albeit still nervous, question: what do we do with this stuff? The superstitious villagers continued to argue for reburial.
It's bad feng shui.
They insisted.
It's an omen.
They pointed to the continued lack of rain as proof that the heavens were displeased. But the younger generation, particularly those who had done the digging, started to see things differently. The initial shock was wearing off, and the sheer uniqueness of the find was starting to sink in. These weren't just crude idols. The detail on the armor, the realistic rendering of the torsos, this was something special. The production team leader, a man named Fang Shimin, was a practical man tasked with the welfare of his people. He was less concerned with ancient spirits and more concerned with the village's immediate problems: the failed well, the wasted labor, and the ever-present poverty. He looked at the pile of terracotta fragments not as a curse, but as a potential, albeit bizarre, asset. He reasoned that old things had value. The county cultural center was known to pay a small amount for antiquities turned in by farmers. It was a way for the government to preserve history and for the farmers to make a little extra money. Usually, this meant an old coin or a piece of a clay pot. No one had ever tried to turn in a life-sized ceramic man before.
We can't just leave them here.
Fang argued in a village meeting.
And we can't just throw them back in the hole. We spent days digging. We should at least see if they're worth anything.
He proposed a simple, pragmatic solution. He would take some of the more interesting pieces to the cultural official in Lintong County Town and see what he said. This seemed like a reasonable compromise. It acknowledged that the items were unusual without fully validating the fears of a curse. It offered a path forward that didn't involve simply undoing their hard work. So, a decision was made. They selected a few of the more complete-looking fragments, a torso, a few pieces of limbs, and the most intriguing find of all, a life-sized head that they had managed to unearth. It was this head that was the most captivating. It had individual strands of hair meticulously carved, a strong jawline, and a calm, determined expression. It looked real. They also gathered up a bundle of the bronze arrowheads. The mode of transport was as humble as the village itself, a wooden flatbed cart. Not a car, not a truck, but a simple, man-powered cart with 2 wheels and 2 long handles. These carts were the workhorses of rural China, used for hauling everything from grain and fertilizer to furniture and building materials. Fang Shimin and another villager loaded the terracotta pieces onto the cart. It was a strange cargo. The silent, stoic head stared up at the sky from the wooden bed of the cart, jostling against a broken torso. It must have been a bizarre sight, this cartload of ancient body parts being trundled down the dusty roads. The journey to the county town was several miles. They pushed and pulled the heavy cart along the uneven dirt tracks that served as roads, kicking up a cloud of fine, yellow dust with every step. The sun beat down on them. Other farmers heading to market with chickens or vegetables would have stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and amusement. What on earth were these men from Xi'an hauling? It looked like they had robbed a temple. When they finally arrived in Lintong, they navigated the busier streets to the county cultural center. This wasn't a grand museum, but a small, modest government office, likely staffed by a handful of people responsible for local historical preservation, propaganda, and cultural events. Fang Shimin, a farmer more comfortable with soil than with bureaucracy, walked in, feeling out of place. He explained, probably with some hesitation, that his village had been digging a well and had found these things. He gestured towards the cart outside. The initial reaction was likely one of mild, professional curiosity. Officials at these rural posts were used to farmers bringing in oddities. Most of the time, it was nothing significant. An official, perhaps a clerk or a low-level cadre, would have come out to inspect the strange cargo. Their eyes would have fallen on the cart, and then widened. They were probably expecting a few shards of pottery, maybe a broken roof tile with a fancy design. What they saw instead was a life-sized human head, crafted with a realism that was startling, lying next to a torso clad in armor. This was not a common pot. This was something else entirely. They would have picked up one of the bronze arrowheads, feeling its weight and its unnerving sharpness. The officials' professional demeanor would have cracked. This was far beyond their pay grade. They knew enough about antiquities to recognize that this was not a local craftsman's work from a few decades ago. The style, the material, the sheer scale of it hinted at something far older, far more important. They paid Fang Shimin a small sum for the fragments, reports vary, but it was likely around 10 yuan per cartload, a welcome bit of cash for the struggling village. But the real transaction wasn't the money. It was the information. The discovery had now officially left the realm of village folklore and entered the world of Chinese archaeology. The cart had delivered its message. And someone was about to listen. The news of the strange terracotta fragments, delivered by a farmer on a wooden cart, began its slow journey up the bureaucratic ladder of the Lintong Cultural Center. The initial officials who saw the pieces were intrigued but also cautious. They were local administrators, not trained archaeologists. They knew enough to know this was significant, but not enough to understand how significant. The pieces were carefully unloaded and stored in a back room, away from public view. The tile gods of Xi'an village were now official government property. For a little while, not much happened. The report sat on a desk. The wheels of 1970s Chinese bureaucracy could turn very slowly. The country was at the tail end of the Cultural Revolution, a period where anything old was often viewed with suspicion, sometimes even destroyed. Valuing and preserving feudal-era artifacts was a politically sensitive act. An official had to be careful. The story might have ended there, with the fragments gathering dust in a storeroom, dismissed as a local curiosity. But the rumor of the find began to circulate within the small world of the county's cultural workers. It was a piece of gossip too strange to ignore. A life-sized pottery man? Dug up from a well? The whispers eventually reached the ears of a man named Zhao Kangmin. Zhao was not a high-ranking official. He was a mid-level archaeologist and historian working at the cultural center. He was, in essence, the county museum's curator, restorer, and primary scholar, all rolled into one. He was in his late 30s, a quiet, studious man with a passion for the history that lay, quite literally, just under his feet. He had spent his career documenting local history, collecting artifacts, and trying to piece together the puzzles of the past from the meager clues the earth provided. Zhao had heard stories like this before. Farmers were always finding things. Most of the time, it was wishful thinking or a misunderstanding. He'd seen countless dragon bones that turned out to be from a cow, and ancient jade that was just a pretty green rock. So, when a colleague mentioned that some farmers from Xiang village had brought in pieces of a pottery god, his initial reaction was one of professional skepticism. He was busy. He had reports to write, other artifacts to classify. He nodded politely and filed the information away in the back of his mind. But the description lingered. Life-sized. Armor. A realistic head. This didn't sound like a typical folk artifact. Lintong County was a special place. Its historical significance was monumental. It was the home of the first emperor's mausoleum complex, a vast, largely unexcavated area that was known to be one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. Every historian and archaeologist in the region knew the legends associated with Qin Shi Huang's tomb, stories of rivers of mercury, booby traps, and a vast underground palace. A few days later, another colleague brought it up, providing more detail. He described the torso, the incredible detail of the armor plating, the sheer scale of the fragments. He mentioned the bronze arrowheads, still sharp after centuries in the earth. This time, the details snagged Zhao Kangmin's full attention. A switch flipped in his mind. His skepticism began to morph into a thrilling, almost unbelievable suspicion. Life-sized pottery soldiers. An army to guard an emperor in the afterlife. It was a concept that was almost too fantastical to be real, but it aligned perfectly with the historical records of the grandiose and obsessive first emperor. The ancient historian Sima Qian had written about the wonders of the tomb, but his accounts were often dismissed as legend or exaggeration. Could it be? Could these farmers have accidentally stumbled upon something related to the legendary tomb? The location was right. Xiang village was less than a mile from the great mound of the emperor's tomb. The description of the artifacts, warriors, not gods or peasants, was a critical clue. Zhao's heart began to beat faster. This was no longer just a rumor, it was a professional imperative. If this was what he suspected it might be, it would be the most important discovery of his life, and one of the most significant in the history of archaeology. The potential was staggering. But he had to be sure. He couldn't rely on second-hand descriptions from his non-expert colleagues. He had to see the evidence with his own eyes. He put down the report he was working on. The dusty records of local gazetteers could wait. He went to the storeroom where the fragments from Xiang were being kept. The room was probably cool and dim, smelling of dust and old paper. And there they were. Piled unceremoniously on the floor were the pieces of the terracotta man. He knelt down, his initial skepticism melting away completely, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated awe. He picked up the head. It was heavy, solid. He traced the lines of the carved hair, the stern set of the mouth, the calm, unblinking eyes. This was not folk art. This was the product of an imperial workshop, made with a level of skill and resources unavailable to anyone but the emperor himself. He examined the torso, noting how the small plates of armor were laced together. He picked up one of the bronze arrowheads. It felt cold and deadly in his palm. He knew. In that instant, with the weight of the terracotta head in his hands, Zhao Kangmin knew. This was it. This was real. The legends were true. The farmers hadn't found a tile god. They had found a soldier from the lost army of Emperor Qin Shi Huang. And if there was one, there were likely more. Many, many more. The quiet storeroom was suddenly the most exciting place on earth. The realization that crashed over Zhao Kangmin in that dusty storeroom was electric. It was a dizzying cocktail of academic excitement, historical awe, and a sudden, crushing sense of responsibility. He was, at that moment, possibly the only person in the world who understood the true significance of the terracotta fragments lying on the floor. This wasn't just another artifact, it was a key. A key that could unlock one of the greatest mysteries in Chinese history. His first instinct was preservation. These fragments were priceless. They couldn't just lie around in a storeroom. He immediately began the painstaking work of cleaning and reassembling the pieces. This was his craft, his passion. With the gentle touch of a surgeon, he cleaned the centuries of dirt from the fragments, his brushes revealing more and more detail. He used glue and plaster, carefully fitting the broken shards together. It was like working on the world's most important jigsaw puzzle. Slowly, painstakingly, a figure began to take shape on his workshop table. He pieced together the torso, the arms, the legs. He reattached the head. And as the final pieces came together, he had resurrected the first complete terracotta warrior to be seen by human eyes in over 2,000 years. It stood nearly 6 feet tall, a silent, imposing figure. Even in the sterile environment of the workshop, its presence was powerful. It stared out with the same stoic gaze it had held while buried in the earth, a silent sentinel from a forgotten age. But seeing it wasn't enough. Zhao knew he had to go to the source. The well. The village of Xi'an. The artifacts in his workshop were just the first clues. The real treasure, the real story, was still in the ground. What else was down there? How many more were there? Was it a squad? A platoon? An entire army? He had to know. There was no official car to requisition, no government chauffeur to drive him. This was still a small-scale, local affair. For Zhao Kangmin, the journey of a lifetime would begin with a much more humble mode of transport, his bicycle. It was an old, sturdy, black bicycle, the kind that was ubiquitous in China at the time. A flying pigeon, perhaps, or a forever. It was reliable, and it was his. He gathered a small bag with his tools, a trowel, brushes, a notebook, a camera if he could get one. He couldn't wait for official permission or a formal expedition to be organized. The risk was too great. The farmers, not understanding the historical value, might damage the site further. Or worse, they might simply give up and rebury everything to ward off bad luck. Time was of the essence. So, on a bright spring morning, Zhao Kangmin hopped on his bicycle and started pedaling. He rode out of the county town of Lintong, leaving the paved streets behind for the dusty, rutted tracks that led into the countryside. The journey was about 20 miles, not a short ride on a single-speed, heavy steel bicycle. The landscape he pedaled through was the very heart of ancient China. This was the Wei River Valley, the cradle of the Qin dynasty. He rode past fields of wheat, small villages with mud brick houses, and the ever-present, silent mound of the first emperor's tomb looming in the distance. To any other observer, it was a simple, rural landscape. To Zhao, it was a living museum. Every hill, every stream could hold a secret. He felt a palpable sense of anticipation, the thrill of the hunt. He was a historical detective riding to the scene of a 2,200-year-old crime, or rather, a 2,200-year-old mystery. The sun climbed higher. The pedaling became more laborious. Dust kicked up from the road, coating his clothes and face. He would have been sweating, his legs burning, but it's unlikely he noticed. His mind was racing, consumed with questions. What would he find? Would the villagers be cooperative? Would they even let him see the site? After a few hours of steady pedaling, he finally saw the cluster of low-slung houses and the persimmon trees that marked the village of Xi'an. He rode into the village, a stranger on a bicycle, drawing curious stares from the locals. Children stopped their games to watch him pass. He would have looked like a city official, which could be an intimidating sight. He asked for the men who had been digging the well. He was pointed towards the home of Yang Jifa. He found them, a group of farmers, likely sitting in the shade, their faces still etched with a mixture of confusion and anxiety over their discovery. Zhao Kangmin, the scholar from the city, approached them. He wasn't an imposing figure. He didn't arrive with the swagger of a high official. He was just a man, dusty from his long ride, with an air of quiet intensity. He introduced himself, explaining that he was from the cultural center and had seen the pottery man they had brought in. He didn't scold them or treat them as ignorant peasants. He spoke to them with respect, his voice filled with an excitement he couldn't hide.
What you have found
He told them, his words careful but firm.
is not a god or a spirit. It is an artifact. It is very, very important. Can you show me where you found it?
The farmers, who had been treated as bearers of bad luck by some of their neighbors, were likely relieved and intrigued by this official validation. This man wasn't afraid. He was excited. He called their find important. Their strange discovery was suddenly elevated from a local problem to a matter of historical significance. They agreed. They led the man from the city, the archaeologist who had ridden for hours on a humble bicycle, out to the field with the abandoned well. They led him to the edge of the pit, where history was waiting to be properly introduced. Zhao Kangmin stood at the edge of the pit, the wind whipping dust around his ankles. He peered down into the hole the farmers had dug. It was just as he'd imagined, a rough-hewn cylinder cut into the reddish earth. Piled near the edge were the fragments the villagers hadn't taken into town, more terracotta limbs, shards of armor, a chaotic jumble of history waiting to be read. His professional training took over. The farmers saw a failed well and a pile of spooky junk. Zhao saw a cross-section of the earth, a layered cake of time. He could see the different strata of soil, and he knew that the level where the fragments were found, about 15 feet down, was the crucial one. He asked the farmers to lower him into the pit. With a rope tied around his waist, he was carefully lowered down. As his feet touched the bottom, the bright, noisy world of the surface vanished. He was now in a cooler, quieter space, a subterranean chamber that had, until a few days ago, been sealed for 2 millennia. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, the faint, dry scent of antiquity. He wasn't alone with just dirt and shadows. He was standing amidst the evidence. The bottom of the pit was littered with more fragments. He could see where Yang Jifa's pick had struck the first warrior. He knelt down, his heart pounding with a scholar's thrill. This was it. The primary context. The place of discovery. He didn't start digging wildly. He worked with the patience and precision of a bomb disposal expert. Using his own small trowel and brushes, he began to gently clear the earth away from the edges of the pit, exploring the layer where the first warrior had been found. The farmers above watched in silence, fascinated by this city man who treated their junk pile with such reverence. He worked methodically, his fingers tracing the outlines of buried shapes. Soon, he found what he was looking for. Not just a loose fragment, but a piece that was still in situ, still in its original position. It was the top of a head, just the crown and the intricately carved top knot of hair, peeking out of the packed earth of the pit wall. He held his breath. This was the moment of truth. Carefully, reverently, he began to brush the soil away. It was like peeling back a 2,200-year-old curtain. First, the forehead emerged. Then the strong, straight bridge of a nose. The high cheekbones. The closed, serene mouth. The ears. Within minutes of careful work, he had uncovered an entire, perfectly preserved head, still attached to its neck and shoulders, staring at him from the wall of earth. It was an intimate, almost spiritual experience. He was the first person to look into this warrior's face since the craftsman who made it and the laborers who buried it. The warrior's expression was one of calm, stoic resolve. It wasn't a god. It wasn't a monster. It was a soldier. A human face, frozen in time. Zhao Kangmin's hands, steady until now, probably trembled slightly. The theories, the suspicions, the long bike ride, it all culminated in this one, silent, face-to-face encounter. He continued to clear the area around the head and shoulders. He could see the collar of the warrior's uniform, the straps of his armor. This wasn't a random piece thrown into a hole. This soldier was standing upright, in formation with others, when the earth had claimed him. He was part of something bigger. He looked around the cramped space at the bottom of the well. He could now see other shapes embedded in the walls. The curve of a shoulder here, the edge of an armored chest plate there. The farmers hadn't just dug a well. They had punched a hole right through the middle of a subterranean army. The implications were staggering. If this one spot, chosen at random by thirsty farmers, contained multiple, life-sized, standing warriors, then how far did this formation extend? Did it go on for a few feet? A few yards? Or did it stretch across the entire field? The scale of what lay buried here, just beneath the persimmon trees, was suddenly expanding in his mind to an almost unimaginable size. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only an hour or two, he signaled to be pulled up. He emerged from the pit, blinking in the bright sunlight, his clothes covered in dirt, his mind reeling. He looked at the farmers, at Yang Zhifa and his brothers, with a new kind of respect. These men, in their simple quest for water, had made the most important archaeological find in modern Chinese history. He turned to them, his voice filled with an urgency and gravity they had not heard from him before.
Stop digging.
He said, the words sharp and clear.
Don't touch anything else. Don't let anyone near here. What you have found is a national treasure. You must protect it.
He knew he had to get back to the county town. He had to report this. This was no longer a local matter for the Lintong Cultural Center. This was something for Beijing. The first, thrilling, personal moment of discovery was over. Now, the huge, complex machinery of the state would have to be set in motion. He had seen the first soldier in the ground. He had looked into his eyes. And now, he had to tell the world what he had found. The Silent Army's 2,000-year watch was about to be interrupted in a very big way. As Zhao Kangmin pedaled furiously back to Lintong, his mind was a whirlwind. The face of the warrior, emerging from the dirt, was seared into his memory. Every detail confirmed his grand hypothesis. The location, just east of the main tomb mound, was significant. Ancient Chinese emperors, considered sons of heaven, traditionally built their tombs to face east, the direction of the rising sun, symbolizing rebirth and power. An army positioned to the east of the tomb would be its vanguard, its primary line of defense, ready to protect the emperor in the afterlife as he faced the new dawn. The style of the armor, the hairstyle, the weapons, everything was consistent with the Qin dynasty. These weren't generic statues. They were meticulous, historically accurate representations of the army that had conquered all of China and forged it into a single empire under Qin Shi Huang. The scattered bronze arrowheads weren't just random artifacts. They were the ammunition for the crossbowmen in this terracotta legion. He wasn't just looking at pottery anymore. He was looking at a perfect, three-dimensional snapshot of the Qin military machine. This discovery had the potential to rewrite history books. For centuries, knowledge of the Qin army had been based on sparse, second-hand written accounts from later dynasties, particularly the Han. Sima Qian, the grand historian, wrote his records a century after the fall of the Qin. While invaluable, his work was still history written by the successors of a vanquished foe. Now, for the first time, historians had the real thing. They could see the armor, not just read about it. They could study the formations, not just guess at them. They could look into the faces of the individual soldiers who made up that legendary, all-conquering force. These were not statue or divine statues. They were terracotta warriors, soldier and horse funerary statues. The name itself was a revelation. Back in his small office, Zhao Kangmin began to work with a frantic energy. He developed the photographs he had taken, the black and white images providing the first stark, visual proof from the site. He wrote a formal report, his hand flying across the page. He titled it, A Report on the Discovery of Qin Dynasty Pottery Figures in Lintong. He described the location, the circumstances of the discovery, the appearance of the figures, and his professional assessment. He stated, with as much academic certainty as he could muster, that these were funerary objects associated with the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang. This was a bold claim. Accusing the long-dead emperor of having commissioned this subterranean force was a huge intellectual leap. The first emperor was a controversial figure in Chinese history, a unifier, but also a tyrant. During the political climate of the 1970s, associating any major discovery with a feudal emperor had to be handled delicately. But Zhao Kangmin's evidence was overwhelming. The sheer scale and quality of the figures pointed to only one possible patron, the emperor himself. No mere nobleman or general would have had the resources, the manpower, or the audacity to commission such a project. This was an imperial undertaking, a manifestation of the emperor's unparalleled power and his obsessive quest for immortality. The report was sent up the chain of command. It landed on the desks of higher officials in the provincial government in Xi'an, the ancient capital city. Just like the initial news from the farmers, it was met with a degree of bureaucratic inertia and skepticism. A local curator claiming to have found the legendary lost army of the first emperor? It sounded like something out of a fantasy novel. However, Zhao's report was detailed, professional, and accompanied by the startling photographs. The images of the stoic, life-sized warrior he had pieced together and the dirt-caked face peering from the wall of the well were undeniable. They couldn't be ignored. The provincial authorities dispatched their own team of more senior archaeologists to Lintong to verify the claims. When these experts arrived and saw the evidence for themselves, the restored warrior in Zhao's workshop and the site at Xiang village, their skepticism vanished, replaced by the same awe that had struck Zhao. They immediately confirmed his assessment. This was real. This was monumental. The news was now deemed too important for the provincial government to handle alone. This was a discovery of national, and indeed international, significance. The report, now bolstered by the endorsement of senior archaeologists, continued its journey, this time to the highest levels of government in Beijing. It eventually reached the desk of a man named Lin Yishan, a historian and head of the State Administration of Cultural Heritage. He was one of China's most respected archaeological authorities. He read the report from the remote province of Shaanxi. He saw the photos. He understood instantly. The discovery also came to the attention of the highest echelons of the Chinese political leadership. At a time when China was just beginning to re-engage with the outside world after years of isolation, a discovery of this magnitude was more than just a historical find. It was a source of immense national pride. It was a tangible link to the glory of China's ancient past, a symbol of the nation's long and brilliant history. The decision from Beijing was swift and decisive. The site was to be secured immediately. All local, uncoordinated digging was to cease. A formal, state-sponsored archaeological team, composed of the best experts in the country, was to be formed and dispatched to Lintong without delay. The quiet, local discovery made by a handful of farmers looking for water was now a full-blown national project. The lone archaeologist on his bicycle had done his job. He had recognized the truth, protected the site, and sounded the alarm. Now, the cavalry was coming. and they were about to uncover a spectacle that would stun the world. The news from Beijing came down not like a whisper, but like a thunderclap. The sleepy county of Lintong suddenly found itself at the epicenter of a major national operation. The phone call that truly set things in motion was the one that established the official Shaanxi Provincial Qin Figurines Archaeological Team. This wasn't just a handful of local experts anymore. It was a state-sanctioned, top-tier group of archaeologists, historians, conservators, and technicians drawn from universities and institutions across China. Their mandate was clear: excavate, study, and preserve the site at Xiang Village. The full resources of the state were now behind this project. Trucks carrying equipment and supplies began to rumble down the same dusty roads that Zhao Kangmin had navigated on his bicycle. Temporary shelters and sheds were erected around the site, transforming the quiet persimmon grove into a bustling, organized work camp. A fence was put up, and guards were posted. The abandoned well and its secrets were now officially a protected archaeological zone. The arrival of this team was a strange and awe-inspiring sight for the villagers of Xiang. Their cursed field was now the subject of intense, official interest. Men and women from the city, speaking with different accents, armed with strange tools, delicate brushes, dental picks, measuring tapes, and sophisticated cameras, swarmed over the area. The farmers, including Yang Zhifa and his brothers, were hired as laborers, their intimate knowledge of the local soil now a valuable asset to the scientific team. It was a surreal turn of events. Just weeks before, they were trying to get water out of this ground. Now they were being paid to help pull an army out of it. The leader of the newly formed team was a veteran archaeologist named Yuan Zhongyi. He was a seasoned field excavator, a man who understood both the science of archaeology and the complex logistics of managing a large-scale dig. He and his colleagues stood at the edge of the original well, now the designated starting point of their investigation, and planned their attack. They knew they couldn't just continue digging the well deeper. That was like reading a book by punching a hole through its pages. They needed to understand the context, the layout, the bigger picture. Their first step was to carefully and systematically expand the excavation horizontally from the original point of discovery. They laid out a precise grid system over the field, turning the patch of farmland into a giant piece of graph paper. Each square of the grid was a unit, to be excavated layer by layer, its contents meticulously recorded. They didn't use heavy machinery. This was an operation that required a surgeon's touch. The team members, often kneeling or lying on wooden planks suspended over the pit to distribute their weight, began to remove the topsoil. It was slow, painstaking work. They scraped away the earth, centimeter by centimeter, with small trowels and bamboo picks. For the first few feet, it was just dirt. The same packed, reddish earth the farmers had dug through. But as they reached the depth of about 15 feet, the same level as the original find, the real work began. A cry of excitement would go up from one square of the grid.
I've got something.
Then another, from a few yards away.
Here too.
Slowly, as if developing a giant photograph, a scene of breathtaking scale began to emerge from the earth. The archaeologists uncovered not just one or two more warriors, but dozens. Then hundreds. They were standing in long, parallel trenches, as if in formation for a grand imperial review. They were arranged in ranks, row upon row of silent soldiers, facing east. The team uncovered infantrymen, some in armor, some in simple robes. They found archers, kneeling in a ready-to-fire position. They found charioteers, standing behind the ghostly outlines of their long-disintegrated wooden chariots, their hands still shaped to hold the reins. The scale of the discovery was growing exponentially with every passing day. This wasn't a squad or a platoon. This was a regiment, a legion, an entire army. They realized that the farmers hadn't just stumbled upon a few statues. They had discovered a massive, purpose-built underground structure. The warriors weren't just buried in the dirt. They stood on a paved floor of grey bricks. The trenches they stood in were separated by thick, rammed earth walls. And above their heads, the archaeologists found the charred remains of massive wooden beams and reed mats. A picture of the original structure began to form. This had been a vast, subterranean hall with a wooden roof, supported by earthen walls, covered by layers of matting and soil to conceal it from the surface. At some point after it was built, it seemed this wooden roof had been burned and had collapsed, smashing many of the warriors below and burying the entire scene in earth and ash. This explained why so many of the figures were found in fragments. The pit, which the archaeologists now officially designated Pit Number 1, was revealing itself to be a rectangle of staggering proportions, over 200 meters long and 60 meters wide, larger than a modern football field. And it was filled with soldiers. The initial estimates were mind-boggling. The team calculated that this single pit could contain over 6,000 warriors and horses. The team from Beijing, the phone calls, the official designation, all of it was justified. In fact, it was an understatement. What they were uncovering was beyond anyone's wildest imagination. It was a life-sized, three-dimensional blueprint of the Qin dynasty's military might, a silent, subterranean world that had been waiting for 2 millennia to be rediscovered. The first chapter of the excavation was just beginning, and it was already one of the most astonishing stories in the annals of archaeology. The world of the archaeologists became a universe contained within the boundaries of Pit Number 1. Days started early, in the cool dawn air, and ended late, under the harsh glare of temporary floodlights. The initial excitement of the discovery settled into a rhythm of intense, focused work. Each day brought new wonders and new challenges. The sheer scale of the pit was overwhelming. Standing on the edge, looking down into the excavated trenches, was like looking at a frozen moment from a mythological battle. The warriors stood shoulder to shoulder in their earthen corridors, their silent ranks stretching into the dimness. It was an army trapped in amber, or rather, in terracotta and time. The process of excavating a single warrior was an exercise in extreme patience. Once a figure was partially uncovered, the delicate work of freeing it from the surrounding earth would begin. The soil, compacted over 2,200 years, was almost as hard as cement in some places. Archaeologists used an array of tools that looked like they belonged in a dentist's office or a sculptor's studio: bamboo picks, tiny spatulas, soft brushes, and air puffers. They would first excavate around the figure, creating a pedestal of earth to support it. Then, they would work their way down from the head, gently brushing away the dirt. Each revealed detail was a small victory. The flare of a nostril, the knot of a belt, the intricate tread on the sole of a shoe. It was a slow, intimate process of reintroduction, bringing these ancient soldiers back into the light. Many of the warriors were found shattered, victims of the collapsed roof and the passage of time. These presented a different kind of challenge. They became giant, three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles. The team would carefully collect every single fragment from the area around a shattered figure, meticulously labeling each piece with its exact grid location. Back in the on-site laboratory, conservators would begin the painstaking task of reassembly. They would clean the edges of each shard, identify matching breaks, and use specialized adhesives to piece the soldiers back together. It was a process that could take weeks, or even months, for a single figure. But the reward for this labor was immense. With each restored warrior, the army grew. The sense of a unified, powerful force became more and more palpable. The vanguard of the army, at the eastern end of the pit, was composed of rows of archers and crossbowmen, some standing, some kneeling, a formidable front line. Behind them stood the main force, thousands of armored infantrymen, originally holding long pikes or spears, the wooden shafts of which had long since decayed, leaving only their bronze tips and the soldiers' clenched fists. Interspersed among the infantry were majestic war chariots, each pulled by a team of 4 powerful, life-sized terracotta horses. The horses were as stunning as the soldiers. They were sculpted with a vibrant realism, their muscles tensed, their nostrils flared, their ears pricked as if listening for a command. They conveyed a sense of power and motion, ready to thunder across the battlefield. The organization of the pit was a revelation. It was a perfect representation of a classical Chinese battle formation, just as described in ancient military texts like Sun Tzu's The Art of War. It wasn't just a random collection of statues, it was a functional, organized military unit. The precision, the discipline, the sheer overwhelming numbers, it was a terrifyingly effective projection of the Qin state's power. It was designed to show that the emperor's authority did not end with his death. His ability to command and conquer extended into the afterlife itself. The atmosphere at the dig site was one of constant, hushed reverence. The team members spoke in low voices, as if not to disturb the sleeping army. There was a sense that they were treading on sacred ground. They were not just excavating artifacts, they were bearing witness to an emperor's obsession, to the incredible artistry of a forgotten generation of craftsmen, and to the immense human cost of such a monumental undertaking. Every shovel of dirt, every brushstroke, peeled back another layer of the mystery. They found remnants of the original paint on some of the figures, hidden in crevices and protected from the elements. They found the bronze trigger mechanisms of the crossbows, marvels of ancient engineering. They found that the paved floor sloped gently downwards, a sophisticated drainage system to protect the underground structure from water. The one-time well digger, Yang Zhifa, worked alongside the archaeologists, his shovel now used not for finding water, but for a purpose he could never have imagined. He would watch the scholars as they worked, his initial fear of the tile gods replaced by a profound sense of wonder and pride. He had been the one. His pickaxe had been the knock on the door. He had woken the army. The shock, the awe of what he had uncovered was a feeling that would stay with him, and with the archaeologists, as they continued to reveal the full, breathtaking panorama of the first emperor's silent, eternal guard. As the excavation of pit number 1 deepened, a new and heartbreaking discovery began to emerge, one that added a layer of profound tragedy to the spectacle. When the archaeologists first brushed the dirt from the warriors, they noticed something incredible. In the protected crevices of the armor, under a fold of a robe, or on the underside of a shield, they found vibrant, brilliant colors. These soldiers hadn't been a monotonous army of dull, grayish-brown terracotta. They had been painted. Each one. They had been brought to life in a dazzling palette of mineral pigments: cinnabar red, azurite blue, malachite green, charcoal black, and a rare, complex pigment that would later be called Chinese purple. Their robes had been crimson, their armor trimmed in emerald green, their faces a realistic flesh tone with black painted mustaches and eyebrows. Imagine the scene not as we see it today, but as it was when it was first sealed. A subterranean hall filled with thousands of life-sized figures, each one painted with the brilliant, lifelike colors of a living army. The effect would have been overwhelming, a hyperrealistic tableau of military might, the torchlight glinting off their polished bronze weapons and their brightly colored uniforms. It wasn't just an army, it was a vibrant, living force, frozen a moment before the call to battle. But the archaeologists who made this discovery were witnessing a fleeting miracle. The moment a piece of colored terracotta was exposed to the dry, oxygen-rich air of Shaanxi, a devastating chemical reaction began. The lacquer undercoat, which had been preserved for 2 millennia in the stable, humid environment of the sealed pit, began to curl and flake away from the terracotta surface. The paint, which was bound to the lacquer, flaked off with it. The process was terrifyingly fast. A warrior unearthed with a brightly colored face could, within a matter of minutes, lose its pigment. The vibrant colors would literally turn to dust before the excavator's eyes. A patch of brilliant purple discovered on an officer's sash would crumble away in the time it took to call a colleague over to witness it. The team was watching 2,200 years of history vanish in the blink of an eye. It was a conservation nightmare. They were in a race against time that they couldn't win with the technology available in the 1970s. They tried everything they could think of. They tried to spray the figures with chemical stabilizers. They tried to cover them with plastic sheeting to retain the humidity. But the methods were too crude, the process of decay too rapid. For every warrior they excavated, they had to make an impossible choice. Leave it buried, where its colors would remain preserved but unseen, or excavate it to study its form and context, knowing that its brilliant skin would be sacrificed in the process? It was a source of immense frustration and sadness for the team. They were the first people to see these colors in over 2,000 years, and they were also the last. The photographs they took in those first few frantic seconds after a piece was unearthed became invaluable, tragic records of a beauty that no longer existed. Yuan Zhongyi and his colleagues documented the fleeting colors with meticulous notes and drawings, preserving the memory of what they could not physically save. This ephemeral nature of the discovery changed the way they worked. The excavation became even more careful, more deliberate. Every patch of color, no matter how small, was treated as a priceless treasure. The discovery of a new, well-preserved patch of pigment was cause for both celebration and a frantic, high-stakes conservation effort. The mystery of the vanishing colors also spurred a new field of research. Scientists and conservators began to study the pigments themselves. They discovered that the Chinese purple, sometimes called Han purple, was a synthetic pigment created through a complex process of heating ground minerals to incredibly high and precise temperatures. It was a marvel of ancient chemistry, a man-made color whose formula was lost for centuries and was not rediscovered by modern scientists until the 20th century. The Qin craftsmen weren't just artists, they were sophisticated chemical engineers. The knowledge that the army was once a kaleidoscope of color adds a layer of melancholy to any visit to the museum today. As you look out over the rows of gray figures, you have to use your imagination. You have to picture them as they were meant to be seen, not as stone-colored statues, but as a living, breathing, brilliantly hued fighting force. The gray army we see today is magnificent, but it is a ghost of its former self. It's a powerful reminder that even in the greatest of discoveries, there is often an element of profound and irreversible loss. The act of discovery, in this case, was also an act of unintentional destruction. The army had survived 2,200 years of being buried, only to have its true colors fade away in the first few minutes of its new life in the sun. As the archaeologists meticulously cleaned, catalogued, and reassembled the warriors, another, equally astonishing fact came into focus. It was something they noticed gradually, not in a single eureka moment, but as the population of their restored army grew from a handful to dozens, and then to hundreds. No two faces were the same. This wasn't just a slight variation. It wasn't a case of a few standard molds being used with minor alterations. Every single warrior had a unique, distinct face. The team looked from one restored head to another, and they saw not an army of clones, but an army of individuals. There was the veteran soldier, his brow furrowed, his cheeks etched with deep lines, a look of grim determination on his face. Next to him might stand a much younger recruit, his features smoother, his expression a mixture of focus and perhaps a touch of youthful apprehension. There were soldiers with broad, round faces and others with long, narrow ones. Some had high cheekbones, some had strong, square jaws. Mustaches and beards were styled in a dozen different ways, some thick and bushy, others thin and wispy, some neatly trimmed, others flowing. Even the ears were unique. Just as every human has a unique fingerprint, the specific whorls and shape of the human ear are also highly individual. The archaeologists observed that the ears on the terracotta soldiers were just as varied as their faces. It was an obsessive, almost unbelievable attention to detail. The sculptors who had created this army had gone to extraordinary lengths to create a sense of realism and individuality. They seemed to be working from a clear directive. This was not to be a symbolic army of identical figures. This was to be a portrait of the actual Qin army, a snapshot of the real men who had conquered the warring states. This discovery led to a fascinating theory. Were these actual portraits? Did the craftsmen model the faces on real, living soldiers of the Qin army? It's a tantalizing and romantic idea. You can imagine legions of soldiers lining up to have their likenesses captured in clay by the emperor's artisans. While it's impossible to prove definitively, the sheer variety makes it seem plausible. The faces exhibit a range of ages, moods, and what appear to be different regional characteristics, reflecting an army drawn from all corners of the newly unified empire. The archaeologists started to categorize the faces, not by rank, but by a sort of emotional temperature. There were faces that looked thoughtful, almost philosophical. There were faces that were stern and authoritative. There were calm faces, angry faces, proud faces, and weary faces. It was a silent, clay-bound catalogue of human expression. This individuality extended beyond the faces. The bodies, while assembled from a set of standardized parts, torsos, arms, legs, were customized in their final assembly. A slight turn of the head, a different angle of the arm, a subtle variation in posture, all of these small changes gave each warrior its own sense of presence, its own story. The artists had even varied the hairstyles, which were incredibly elaborate. The soldiers' long hair was shown braided and pinned up in a variety of intricate top knots, each one a small masterpiece of sculpture, likely indicating different ranks or units. This thousand faces phenomenon fundamentally changed the understanding of the site. It wasn't just an act of mass production, it was an act of mass artistry. It humanized the army. It's one thing to be impressed by the scale of 6,000 identical statues. It's another thing entirely to be confronted by 6,000 unique individuals, each with his own face, his own expression, his own silent story. It also spoke volumes about the emperor who commissioned it. Qin Shi Huang wasn't just content to have an army for the afterlife, he wanted his army. The specific men, in all their human variety, who had secured his power on earth were to continue serving him in death. It was a testament to his obsessive nature and his megalomaniacal desire to replicate his entire world, in perfect detail, for his eternal use. For the archaeologists and conservators, this discovery meant that every single head, every single fragment of a face, was a unique and irreplaceable piece of a larger puzzle. When they found a disembodied head, they weren't just finding a piece of a statue, they were being introduced to a new member of the army. They would clean the dirt from its face, and a new personality would emerge from the clay. It transformed their work from a technical process of excavation into something far more personal. They became the custodians of these thousands of individual soldiers, the ones tasked with preserving their unique identities for the world to see. The army was vast, but it wasn't anonymous. It was a crowd of individuals, standing together, waiting silently in the earth. As the dig at pit number 1 progressed, the archaeologists began to find more than just terracotta. Lying amongst the shattered soldiers, scattered on the brick-paved floor, and sometimes still clutched in the clay fists of the warriors, were the actual weapons intended for this subterranean army. And they were astonishing. Unlike the wooden shafts of spears and the lacquered shields, which had long since rotted away, The bronze components of the weaponry had survived the centuries in remarkable condition. The team unearthed hundreds, then thousands, of lethal-looking artifacts: long swords, sharp daggers, spearheads, halberds, and most numerously, the trigger mechanisms and arrowheads for the army's crossbows. The sheer quantity was impressive enough, a testament to the industrial scale of Qin dynasty arms manufacturing. But it was the quality and condition of these weapons that left the experts speechless. They pulled a long, slender bronze sword from the mud. As they carefully wiped away the 2,200 years of grime, they saw their own astonished faces reflected on its surface. The blade was still gleaming, and it was still sharp. In one now famous instance, an archaeologist was cleaning a bundle of bronze arrowheads when he accidentally sliced his finger. The weapon, last touched by a Qin soldier, was still perfectly capable of drawing blood. This was unheard of. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. Over time, it should oxidize, developing a fuzzy green patina, becoming dull and brittle. Ancient bronze weapons from other parts of the world, even those much younger, are almost always heavily corroded when excavated. But these Qin weapons looked like they had been manufactured last week. This led to a major scientific investigation. What was the secret to their incredible preservation? The initial theory, which became a popular legend, was that the Qin weaponsmiths had developed a miraculous, space-age technology, chromium plating. Early analysis of the blades did indeed show trace amounts of chromium on the surface. For a time, the world was captivated by the idea that these ancient craftsmen had mastered a complex chemical plating process that wasn't invented in the West until the 20th century. It seemed to be another example of the Qin's almost supernatural technological prowess. However, more recent and rigorous scientific study has revised this exciting theory. It turns out the chromium wasn't an intentional plating. The traces of chromium likely came from the lacquer preservatives used on the weapons or from contamination from the surrounding soil. The real secret to the weapon's preservation was twofold, and in some ways, even more impressive. First, the metallurgy itself was exceptional. The Qin craftsmen were masters of their trade. They had perfected the bronze alloy, using a precise recipe with a high percentage of tin and other trace elements, creating a metal that was incredibly strong, flexible, and naturally resistant to corrosion. Each type of weapon used a slightly different alloy, optimized for its specific function. A sword blade, which needed to be flexible and resilient, had a different composition than a rigid, piercing arrowhead. This was bespoke, high-tech manufacturing on an industrial scale. Second, the unique soil conditions of the pit played a crucial role. The yellow earth of Shaanxi is moderately alkaline and has a very low organic content. This, combined with the sealed, stable environment of the pit, created a kind of natural time capsule, inhibiting the chemical reactions that cause oxidation. So, it wasn't a single miracle technology, but a combination of superior craftsmanship and fortunate environmental factors that delivered these pristine weapons into the hands of modern archaeologists. The weapons themselves told a story of a ruthlessly efficient military. The crossbows were particularly terrifying. The team found their bronze trigger mechanisms, complex devices with 3 moving parts, all mass-produced with astonishing precision. These were not simple bows. They were powerful, sophisticated weapons that could be fired by a trained but not necessarily brawny soldier, allowing the Qin to field huge numbers of lethal crossbowmen. The parts were so precisely standardized that they were interchangeable, a key principle of mass production that allowed for easy battlefield repairs. They found swords that were longer than those of their rivals, giving Qin soldiers a crucial reach advantage in close combat. They found the fearsome Ji, or dagger axe, a combination spear and axe designed for hooking and slashing at enemies. Every weapon was a perfect blend of form and function, stripped of any unnecessary decoration, built for one purpose only, to be brutally effective. The discovery of these weapons added a chilling dimension to the silent terracotta army. The soldiers weren't just symbolic guardians. They were fully equipped for war. They had state-of-the-art, factory-fresh weapons ready for use. Standing there in the pit, surrounded by the stoic clay soldiers and the glint of their razor-sharp blades, the archaeologists could almost feel the deadly potential of this force. The emperor hadn't just commissioned a monument. He had built a fully armed, eternally vigilant killing machine to ensure his dominion over the next world. To stand in that pit, surrounded by the silent, steadfast faces of the soldiers and the cold, deadly glint of their weapons, is to be confronted by a single, overwhelming question: why? Why would anyone do this? What kind of mind, what level of ambition and fear could possibly conceive of such a project and, more importantly, have the absolute power to make it a reality? To answer that, we have to rewind the clock. We have to leave the archaeologists in their dusty pit for a moment and travel back more than 2,000 years to meet the man who ordered it all. His name was Ying Zheng. He was born into a world of relentless, chaotic violence. The China he knew was not a single country, but a patchwork of 7 major warring states, locked in a centuries-long, bloody free-for-all that historians aptly call the Warring States period. It was a time of shifting alliances, constant betrayal, and unimaginable slaughter. Cities were razed, fields were salted, and entire armies were annihilated. This was the brutal, paranoid world that shaped him. He ascended the throne of the state of Qin as a young boy, and he didn't just survive, he thrived. Ying Zheng was a genius, a visionary, and by all accounts, a ruthless megalomaniac. He was the man who would end the chaos. Through a series of brilliant and merciless military campaigns, he did what no one before him had ever managed to do. He conquered all 6 of his rival states, one by one, and forged them into a single, unified entity. In 221 BC, he declared himself Qin Shi Huang, which translates to First Sovereign Emperor of Qin. He wasn't just a king anymore. He was something new, something grander. He was the emperor of everything under the heavens. His ambition didn't stop at conquest. He wanted to erase the very memory of the old divisions. He embarked on a sweeping, obsessive program of standardization. He standardized the currency, melting down the old coins of the various states and issuing a single, round coin with a square hole in the middle. He standardized weights and measures. He even standardized the width of axles on carts and chariots, so that all vehicles would fit the ruts on the new imperial highways he was building. Think about that for a second. It's brilliant logistics, but it's also the kind of micromanagement that suggests a personality obsessed with absolute control. Most famously, he standardized the written language, forcing the entire empire to adopt the script used by his home state of Qin. This was perhaps his most lasting legacy, creating a unified cultural identity that has held China together for millennia. But it came at a cost. He was notoriously intolerant of dissent. He ordered the burning of books that challenged his authority and was said to have buried scholars alive who dared to criticize him. He was a unifier, but his tools were iron and fear. And this is the key to understanding the Terracotta Army. Here was a man who had achieved total control over the known world. He had bent millions of people to his will, reshaped society, and literally redrawn the map. But there was one thing he couldn't control, one enemy he couldn't conquer: his own mortality. The fear of death became his ultimate obsession. For a man who had controlled everything, the idea of losing it all, his power, his empire, his very consciousness, was an intolerable prospect. So he launched a 2-pronged attack against it. Plan A was to achieve literal, physical immortality. He sent vast fleets of ships into the eastern seas in search of the mythical Isles of the Immortals, hoping to find the fabled elixir of life. He consulted with alchemists and mystics who promised him potions of longevity, many of which likely contained toxic substances like mercury, which ironically may have hastened his death rather than preventing it. Plan B was the Terracotta Army. It was the ultimate insurance policy. If he couldn't take his living body into the next life, he would do the next best thing. He would take everything else. His tomb was not just a burial place. It was a microcosm of his empire, an entire world for him to rule in perpetuity. The legends recorded by the historian Sima Qian speak of a vast underground palace, with ceilings depicting the heavens and a floor mapping his entire empire, complete with rivers and oceans of flowing mercury. And what is an emperor without his army? He couldn't rely on the spirits of the dead to protect him. He needed his own force, loyal only to him. He needed the very soldiers who had won him his empire on Earth to secure his dominion in the afterlife. So he commissioned a life-sized, fully equipped, eternally loyal replica of his elite guard. This army wasn't just a tribute or a monument. In the mind of Qin Shi Huang, it was a functional necessity. It was his vanguard, his secret service, his guarantee of power in a world unseen. So when the archaeologists in the 1970s brushed the dirt from those unique, individual faces, they weren't just looking at pottery. They were looking directly into the heart of the first emperor's obsession. Each soldier was a single data point in a sprawling, paranoid, and breathtakingly audacious plan to cheat death itself. The emperor, it seemed, had a very thorough plan for his eternal security. But back in the 20th century, the archaeologists digging in the Shaanxi dirt were beginning to realize that the full scope of his plan was even larger and more complex than the mind-boggling scale of Pit Number 1 suggested. As they continued to define the boundaries of that first massive trench, a nagging question hung in the air. Is this all there is? It seemed unlikely. An army of this size would need more than just a massive block of infantry. It would need cavalry, command structures, support units. The layout of Pit 1 was magnificent, but it felt like only one part of a larger military machine. So, the team began a systematic survey of the surrounding fields. This wasn't random digging. It was a careful, scientific probing of the earth, using long steel drills to take core samples. They would drill down, pull up a sample of earth, and examine it for any telltale signs of human activity, shards of terracotta, flecks of charcoal from burned beams, or the gray brick dust of a paved floor. For weeks, the drilling continued. Drill, pull, examine. Drill, pull, examine. Most of the samples were just dirt. But then, in the spring of 1976, about 20 meters north of the first pit, a drill came up with something. A fragment of a warrior's helmet. Then another sample revealed the familiar gray brick. They had found something. Carefully, they began to excavate. What they uncovered was Pit Number 2. And it was immediately clear that this was a different beast altogether. If Pit 1 was the solid, immovable main battle line of the army, Pit 2 was its elite, mobile strike force. It was smaller than the first pit, and laid out in a complex L shape. It wasn't a single, uniform mass of soldiers. It was a sophisticated, combined arms unit, a testament to the tactical flexibility of the Qin army. In one section of the pit, they found a large squadron of cavalry. Here were the first discoveries of standing cavalrymen, each one beside his trusty steed. The horses were sculpted with the same dynamic realism, but were clearly a different breed from the heavier chariot horses, sleeker, more agile. Their riders were dressed for speed, in shorter armor and practical caps. In another section, they uncovered a large phalanx of kneeling archers, positioned in neat rows. This formation was a death trap for any approaching enemy. The front ranks of kneeling archers could fire, while the ranks of standing archers behind them could shoot over their heads, creating a continuous, deadly rain of arrows. It was here that they unearthed one of the most famous and perfectly preserved figures of the entire complex, the kneeling archer. Found almost completely intact, he is a masterpiece of sculpture. His head is bowed slightly in concentration, his hands positioned as if readying his crossbow. The detail is breathtaking, right down to the meticulously carved tread on the soles of his shoes, a pattern designed to give him a firm grip on the ground. Pit 2 also contained numerous war chariots and more infantry, all arranged in smaller, more flexible units. It was a snapshot of a military that understood the importance of specialized troops and coordinated attacks. It showed that the Terracotta Army wasn't just for show, it was designed with real battlefield tactics in mind. The discoveries in Pit 2 were stunning, but the survey continued. And just a few months later, the drills hit again. This time, they found Pit number 3, located to the west of Pit 1 and north of Pit 2. And this one was the strangest of all. It was the smallest of the 3 pits, shaped like a U. And as the archaeologists cleared the dirt, they realized what was missing. There were no vast ranks of infantry. There were no cavalry units. There were no archers poised to fire. The pit was almost empty by comparison. Instead of thousands of soldiers, they found only 68. And these were not common soldiers. They were all high-ranking officers, distinguished by their more elaborate armor and ceremonial headgear. They stood facing each other along the arms of the U, as if in conference. In the center of the pit was a single, ornate war chariot, its horses beautifully rendered. But this chariot wasn't arrayed for battle. It was decorated, ceremonial. The most peculiar finds, however, were not the warriors, but the discovery of deer antlers and animal bones, suggesting that the pit had been a site of pre-battle ritual and divination. The leaders would consult the omens here before committing their troops to action. The conclusion was inescapable. Pit 3 was not a fighting unit. It was the army's nerve center, the command post, the headquarters. If Pit 1 was the army's muscle and Pit 2 was its fast-moving fist, Pit 3 was its brain. This was where the ghostly generals would have met to plan their strategy, to receive their orders from the spirit of the emperor himself. The discovery of these 2 new pits transformed the archaeologists' understanding of the site. They now had a complete picture of a military hierarchy. They had the main force, the elite units, and the high command. The emperor hadn't just built himself an army, he had built a fully functional, multifaceted military organization ready to wage eternal war on his behalf. The random field of persimmon trees was now officially a complex, a garrison, the largest and most detailed military model ever created. While the archaeologists were meticulously working in their dusty pits, piecing together the silent army, word of the discovery was beginning to leak out to the rest of the world. In the mid-1970s, China was still a very closed country, cautiously reopening its doors after decades of political turmoil and isolation. News, especially news of this magnitude, was controlled carefully by the state. The initial reports were confined to internal government publications and academic journals. But a find this spectacular couldn't be kept under wraps for long. The first foreign visitor to see the site, and the one who would unwittingly give the army its famous international nickname, was the French Prime Minister, soon-to-be President, Jacques Chirac. During a state visit to China in September 1978, he was taken to Xi'an. His Chinese hosts, proud of their staggering discovery, brought him to the excavation site. Chirac, a man with a deep appreciation for art and history, was utterly captivated. He walked along the edge of the vast pit, staring down at the silent, ordered ranks of warriors. He was one of the first world leaders to witness the spectacle. He saw the sheer scale of Pit 1, the patient work of the archaeologists, and the restored figures standing guard. Deeply impressed, he turned to his hosts and declared that the discovery was on par with the pyramids of Egypt or the treasures of ancient Greece.
There were the 7 wonders of the world.
He is reported to have said,
And now, we can say that the discovery of the Qin army is the 8th wonder of the world.
the phrase stuck. It was the perfect, grand soundbite to capture the epic nature of the find. The 8th wonder of the world. It was picked up by international news agencies and splashed across the front pages of newspapers from New York to London to Tokyo. Suddenly, the entire planet was buzzing with the news of a lost terracotta army found by farmers in a remote part of China. The impact was immediate and immense. The name Terracotta Warriors entered the global vocabulary. The world, which had often viewed China through a narrow political lens, was suddenly reminded of the incredible depth and richness of its ancient civilization. The warriors became a powerful symbol of China's historical grandeur, a cultural ambassador that transcended language and politics. Tourists, historians, and scholars from around the globe began clamoring for a chance to see this new wonder. The Chinese government, recognizing the immense cultural and diplomatic value of the find, began to make plans. They couldn't have thousands of people tramping through an active archaeological site. They needed a way to protect the army while showcasing it to the world. The solution was as ambitious as the emperor's original project. They would build a museum directly on top of the excavation pits. In 1979, just 5 years after the initial discovery, the Museum of the Terracotta Army of Qin Shi Huang opened its doors to the public. The main structure was a massive, arching hangar-like building, constructed directly over the excavated portions of Pit Number 1. It was a brilliant piece of engineering, a building designed to be a protective shell for the wonder it contained. Visitors could now walk along elevated galleries, looking down into the pit, getting the same breathtaking view that had so impressed Chirac. They could see the warriors in their original context, standing in the very trenches where they had been buried for 2 millennia. They could also see the archaeologists still at work in other sections of the pit, a living demonstration of the ongoing process of discovery. The museum became an instant sensation, a must-see destination on the global tourist trail. It drew a flood of international visitors to a part of China that had previously been far off the beaten path. This influx of tourism brought economic benefits to the region, transforming the quiet city of Xi'an into a bustling international hub. But more than that, the army became a source of immense national pride within China itself. In schools, children learned the story of the first emperor and his clay soldiers. The warriors became an icon, appearing on posters, in films, and in art. They were a tangible connection to the dawn of the Chinese Empire, a symbol of unity, strength, and incredible artistic achievement. The international fame, however, came with its own set of pressures. The demand for traveling exhibitions was huge. A select few of the warriors, the superstars of the army like the kneeling archer, were carefully packed and sent on tours around the world. They drew record-breaking crowds at museums in London, Paris, and Washington, D.C., acting as silent, powerful ambassadors for their country. The 8th wonder, born from a farmer's desperate search for water, had taken its place on the world stage, and its fame was only just beginning. While the Terracotta Army was achieving global stardom and becoming a potent symbol of China's national pride, what became of the man who started it all? What was the fate of Yang Jifa, the quiet farmer who had swung the pickaxe that fateful spring morning? His life, like the field he once plowed, was about to be irrevocably transformed, but not in the way one might expect. In the first few years after the discovery, life didn't change all that much. The initial reward from the County Cultural Center had been a welcome but small sum. When the official archaeological team arrived, Yang Jifa and his brothers were hired as laborers, their wages providing a steady, if modest, income. He was no longer just a farmer, he was a worker on the most important archaeological site in the country. He had a front row seat to the gradual unveiling of the army he had discovered. But as the fame of the warriors grew, a strange thing began to happen. The world wanted to know the origin story. Journalists, both Chinese and foreign, sought out the discoverers. They wanted to hear the tale of the dry well and the tile god. Yang Jifa, a man of the earth who was accustomed to a life of quiet anonymity, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. He was asked to pose for photographs, his hand resting on a shovel, standing near the edge of the pit. He was asked to tell his story over and over again. This newfound attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, there was a sense of pride. He was the man who had found the eighth wonder of the world. He was part of history. On the other hand, it was an intrusion. He was a farmer, not a celebrity. The attention sometimes felt awkward and overwhelming. As the museum was built and opened, a new role was created for him. The museum authorities realized that visitors were fascinated by the human story behind the discovery. So, they offered Yang Jifa a job. He would sit at a small table in the museum's gift shop, signing books and souvenirs. It was a surreal turn of events. The man who had once struggled to coax wheat from the dry ground was now an official part of the tourist experience, his signature a coveted memento. And so, for years, that was his life. He would get up in the morning, travel to the massive museum that now stood on what was once his village's wasteland, and take his seat. He would sit there for hours, a quiet, dignified man with a weathered face and farmer's hands, patiently signing his name, Yang Jifa, in countless books for tourists from every corner of the globe. They would excitedly take a photo with him, this living piece of history, before moving on to the next part of their tour. He became a kind of living artifact himself. He met world leaders and celebrities who came to see the warriors. Bill Clinton, during his visit to the site, sought him out specifically to shake his hand and have a book signed. For a humble farmer from Xiang village, it was a life he could never have imagined. But his story is also tinged with a certain melancholy. He never became wealthy from his discovery. While the warriors generated hundreds of millions of dollars in tourism revenue, Yang Jifa's salary was modest. He lived a simple life. There were stories of disputes and jealousies. Other villagers who were part of the original well-digging team sometimes felt overlooked, arguing that the discovery was a collective effort. The singular fame of Yang Jifa, promoted by the museum, became a source of friction in the small community. Moreover, his connection to the land was severed. The fields where he and his ancestors had farmed were gone, replaced by the museum complex, parking lots, and souvenir stalls. His old village was eventually relocated to make way for the expanding tourist infrastructure. In a profound way, the discovery that made him famous also took away his way of life. He was no longer Yang Jifa, the farmer. He was Yang Jifa, the discoverer of the terracotta warriors. The two identities were forever intertwined. In his later years, he would sit at his signing table, a quiet, almost stoic figure amidst the bustle of the tourist crowds. One wonders what he thought about as he signed book after book. Did he think about the irony of it all? That his desperate search for water had led to this? Did he ever miss the simple, hard life of a farmer? His story is a powerful reminder that history is not just made by emperors and archaeologists. It is often stumbled upon by ordinary people facing ordinary problems. Yang Jifa didn't set out to find a lost army. He just wanted to feed his family. In doing so, he changed not only his own destiny, but also our understanding of the ancient world. He was the unlikely gatekeeper, the man whose shovel turned the key to one of history's greatest secrets. The discovery of the Terracotta Army presented the Chinese government with a monumental challenge, one that went far beyond the archaeology itself. How do you protect something so vast, so fragile, and so deeply significant, while also sharing it with the world? The solution they devised was as ambitious as the army itself. they would not move the army to a museum, but build the museum around the army. This decision was revolutionary for its time. Traditionally, artifacts are removed from their find spot, conserved in a lab, and then displayed in a sterile museum gallery. But here, the context was everything. The power of the warriors came from seeing them in situ, standing in their original formations within the earth. To remove them would be to rob them of their soul. So, the land itself had to become the museum. The construction of the first building over pit number 1 was a feat of engineering. A massive, hangar-like structure with a huge arched roof was erected, spanning the entire excavated area. It had to be built without placing any support columns into the pit itself, which would have damaged the site. The result was a vast, open space that protected the delicate terracotta figures from the rain, sun, and wind, while allowing visitors to experience the awe-inspiring scale of the discovery. This concept of an on-site archaeological park museum was then expanded. Separate, similar structures were built over Pit 2 and Pit 3. This created a campus of discovery, where visitors could move from the main battle force to the elite units and finally to the command headquarters, following the same path of discovery that the archaeologists had. Inside these structures, the work of archaeology and conservation continues to this day, in full view of the public. This is perhaps the most unique aspect of the museum. It is not a static display of finished finds. It is a living, breathing laboratory. Visitors can walk along the galleries and look down to see archaeologists in white coats, kneeling in the dirt, patiently excavating a new section of the pit. They can see conservators in the on-site hospital, painstakingly gluing fragments of a shattered warrior back together. This approach turns every visitor into a witness. You aren't just seeing the past, you are seeing the process of revealing the past. It demystifies archaeology, showing it not as a treasure hunt, but as a slow, painstaking scientific process. Over the decades, the museum complex has grown into a sprawling institution. Beyond the pits themselves, a large exhibition hall was built to display some of the most spectacular individual finds in a more traditional museum setting. Here, you can get nose-to-nose with the superstars of the army, the kneeling archer, the high-ranking generals, the powerful cavalry horses. The lighting is dramatic, allowing you to appreciate the incredible craftsmanship and individual character of each figure up close. It was in this hall that one of the most remarkable finds from the entire necropolis was eventually put on display. In 1980, archaeologists excavating near the emperor's main tomb mound found 2 sets of bronze chariots and horses. They were half-scale models, but their detail was beyond belief. Made almost entirely of bronze, with touches of gold and silver, they were found shattered into thousands of pieces. After years of meticulous restoration, they were revealed to be perfect replicas of the imperial carriages. One is a high-canopied security chariot, with a crossbow mounted at the front and windows for observation. The other is a comfort chariot, an enclosed carriage with sliding windows and a hinged door, where the emperor's spirit could ride in luxury. The detail is microscopic. The reins of the horses are made of delicate bronze chains. The driver's knuckles are individually defined. These 2 chariots are considered among the most complex and beautiful bronze artifacts ever discovered anywhere in the world. The land that was once a quiet patch of farmland has been utterly transformed. It is now one of the world's premier tourist destinations, a city unto itself with vast parking lots, hotels, restaurants, and an endless sea of souvenir stalls selling miniature warriors of every size and quality. The economic impact on the region has been immense. But at its heart, the museum's primary mission remains one of preservation. The challenges are ongoing. How do you control the humidity in such a vast space? How do you protect the figures from the cumulative effect of flash photography? And the biggest question of all, the one that led to the tragedy of the vanishing colors. How do you safely excavate the remaining warriors without losing their precious paint? For this reason, large sections of the pits remain deliberately unexcavated. The archaeologists have decided to wait, leaving future discoveries to future generations who will, hopefully, have developed the technology to perfectly preserve what they find. The museum on the land is not just a showcase of the past, it is a promise to the future. The discovery of the Terracotta Army, in all its staggering scale and detail, answered so many questions about the Qin dynasty. It gave us an unprecedented look into their military, their artistry, and their emperor's psyche. But for all the secrets it revealed, it only deepened the one ultimate mystery that still lies at the heart of the entire complex: the tomb of the first emperor itself. The 3 pits of the Terracotta Army, as vast as they are just one small part of a much larger necropolis. They are the outer garrison, the spiritual security detail. The real prize, the focal point of this entire subterranean kingdom, is the tomb mound that lies about a mile to the west of the warrior pits. It's a man-made hill, roughly square-shaped, that rises over 250 feet from the surrounding plain. It's covered in trees and grass, and for centuries, it was just a local landmark, a feature of the landscape that the farmers of Xiang village knew simply as Mount Li. Beneath that hill lies the legendary tomb of Qin Shi Huang, and it remains almost completely untouched. The reason we haven't dug into it is a combination of profound respect for the site and a frank admission of our own technological limitations. The first and most famous warning comes from the ancient historian Sima Qian, writing just a century after the emperor's death. He described the tomb's interior in vivid detail. He wrote of a vast underground palace, filled with rare artifacts and wondrous treasures. He claimed that craftsmen had built models of the emperor's domain, complete with 100 rivers, the Yangtze and the Yellow River, and the Great Sea, all set to flow with mercury. He also wrote that the tomb was protected by automatically firing crossbows, set to kill any intruder who dared to enter. For centuries, these descriptions were dismissed by many as pure fantasy, the kind of legendary embellishment that makes for a good story. But then, we found the Terracotta Army, a discovery so fantastical that it proved Sima Qian might have been understating things, not exaggerating. And modern science has added a chilling layer of credibility to his tales. Scientific surveys of the tomb mound have shown abnormally high concentrations of mercury in the soil directly beneath the center of the hill, in patterns that seem to mimic the layout of rivers and a coastline. Sima Qian's rivers of mercury might actually be real. And if that part is true, what about the booby traps? No government or archaeological body is willing to take that risk. The potential for loss is too great. An intrusive excavation could trigger unknown traps, release toxic mercury vapor, and irrevocably damage the priceless artifacts within by exposing them to the air. The tragedy of the vanishing paint on the warriors serves as a constant, sobering reminder. We know that whatever is inside the tomb, silk banners, painted lacquerware, ancient texts written on bamboo slips, would be far more fragile than the sturdy terracotta soldiers. Exposing them to oxygen after 2,200 years in a sealed environment could cause them to disintegrate in seconds. We currently do not have the technology to excavate and preserve the contents of such a complex tomb safely. And so, we wait. The Chinese government has made it clear: the tomb of the first emperor will not be opened in the foreseeable future. The policy is one of preservation, research, and non-intrusive survey. Archaeologists continue to explore the vast necropolis around the tomb mound, which is estimated to be over 22 square miles. They have found the pits of the terracotta warriors, but they have also found pits with terracotta acrobats, strong men, and musicians meant to entertain the emperor in the afterlife. They have found pits with court officials. They've discovered an underground army made of stone and a stable with the real skeletons of prized horses. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, revealing just how meticulously the Emperor planned to replicate his entire world. The Great Silent Hill remains the ultimate prize, the final chapter of the story that began with a farmer's shovel. It sits there, holding its secrets, a time capsule waiting for a generation with the wisdom and the tools to open it without destroying what's inside. The story of the Terracotta Army, therefore, doesn't really have an ending. It has a pause. The army stands guard, as it has for 2 millennia, protecting a sanctum we can only dream of. We have met the guards at the gate, but the palace itself, the heart of the Empire of Darkness, remains inviolate, its mysteries still locked safely in the earth.